The sky above the city was alive with the sounds of sirens and the distant roar of ships flying overhead. Soldiers lined the streets, their faces tense and focused. Among them was a man named Kyle, who had been thrust into this strange and dangerous world. As an ordinary human, he had no place here, surrounded by alien species, their weapons, and the ever-growing threat of war. Yet, there he was, standing with his back straight and eyes set ahead, preparing for what could be the end of his life. He had been recruited by the military to help defend this alien world, not out of any personal desire, but because he was the only one who could translate the ancient texts they had discovered. The aliens had hoped his skills would provide the edge they needed in their battle against an enemy unlike anything they had ever faced, but Kyle had no idea what he was walking into. The battlefront was chaotic, with aliens and humans fighting side by side, yet all he could think about was one particular alien, a young woman named Arya. She was fierce, confident, and beautiful in a way that was beyond anything he had ever imagined. With her neon blue skin and sharp features, she seemed to embody everything this world was about. He couldn't stop looking at her, and the feeling seemed to be mutual. Every time they crossed paths, her eyes would lock onto his, intense and full of secrets, but it was more than just attraction. There was a tension between them, something unspoken. It was as if they were both on the edge of something that neither of them understood. Then came the moment that would change everything. The battle had escalated, and the enemy was closing in. Kyle and Arya had been assigned to hold a position near the outskirts of the city, and as the night grew darker, their chances of survival grew slimmer. A shadow passed overhead, and the ground trembled as a massive enemy ship descended. Arya's eyes widened as she reached for her weapon, but before she could act, she was suddenly at Kyle's side, grabbing hold of his arm and pulling him away from the incoming blast. "You stay behind me," she ordered, her voice cold and commanding. Kyle had no choice but to follow, and in that moment, he realized that his survival depended on her. But it wasn't just survival he wanted anymore. He didn't know it yet, but something deeper was beginning to stir between them. The enemy was relentless, pushing forward with a force Kyle had never imagined. As Arya and Kyle moved deeper into the city, the sounds of war grew louder. Kyle could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that Arya's presence was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. Arya seemed different now. Her usual bravado was replaced by something more raw, more desperate. She had no time for fear, but Kyle could see it in her eyes. The war had taken its toll on everyone, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. As they rounded a corner, the enemy appeared in full force, their weapons aimed at the two of them. Kyle's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time, he understood what true terror felt like. "Stay close," Arya whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the nearest cover. Just as they reached safety, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath them, and Arya stumbled, nearly falling into Kyle's arms. In that moment, the unthinkable happened. Without warning, she clung to his back, wrapping her arms around him like a monkey. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. He could feel the warmth of her body pressed against his, and despite the madness of the situation, a strange calm washed over him. It was as if time had stopped. Arya's grip tightened, and for the first time, Kyle realized that she wasn't just protecting him, she needed him. He could feel her pulse against his skin, the steady rhythm of her heart matching his own. The alien girl, once so confident and independent, had become something entirely different in this moment. Kyle was no longer just a translator. He was her lifeline, her anchor in the storm. And as they held each other, surrounded by the fury of war, Kyle knew one thing for certain. Their fight was far from over, and it was only just beginning. The city was a war zone. Explosions echoed in the distance. and the ground beneath Kyle's feet shook with every impact. His heart raced, but it was no longer just fear that filled him. As he ran, side by side with Arya, something else began to take root, a sense of purpose. They had become a team, and in that moment, it was all that mattered. The alien girl who had clung to him like a lifeline was now his anchor, keeping him grounded in the midst of chaos. Arya was unlike anyone Kyle had ever met. She was fierce, powerful, and skilled in ways that made him feel like a mere spectator. As they moved through the crumbling streets, he couldn't help but admire her calm, even in the face of danger. It was as if nothing could break her. But Kyle could see the cracks in her armor. There were moments, fleeting but noticeable, when fear crept into her eyes, and it was those moments that made her all the more real to him. They turned a corner and found themselves in a narrow alleyway, hidden from the enemy's view. Arya stopped abruptly and pressed her back against the wall, signaling for Kyle to do the same. He obeyed without question, his mind still reeling from the events of the past few hours. "Stay quiet," Arya whispered, her breath shallow but steady. She was listening, her sharp ears attuned to every sound. Kyle strained his own ears, but all he could hear were the distant sounds of battle. The enemy was closing in. They were everywhere now, and the city, once a bustling metropolis, was quickly becoming a graveyard. "Do you think we can make it out of here alive?" Kyle asked, his voice barely audible. He didn't want to know the answer, but he needed to hear it. Arya turned her head slightly, just enough for her glowing eyes to meet his. "We don't have a choice," she replied. "This is our fight, whether we like it or not." Her voice was resolute, but there was something underneath it, something darker that Kyle couldn't quite place. The war was taking its toll on her too. He could see it in the way her shoulders were tense, in the way her hand gripped her weapon. A little too tightly, Kyle swallowed hard and nodded. He didn't understand all the details of this war, but he understood one thing. Arya was more than just a soldier. She was someone who had been fighting for so long, it had become part of her soul. And yet, despite everything, she had found herself depending on him. They moved again, carefully, silently. Kyle's heart pounded in his chest, and every step felt heavier than the last. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had never faced an enemy he couldn't understand, let alone one that could obliterate him with a single strike. But it was more than that. It was the fear of the unknown, the feeling that at any moment, everything could come crashing down. As they rounded another corner, the sounds of the enemy grew louder. Arya motioned for Kyle to stop, then crouched low, her body blending seamlessly into the shadows. He followed suit, trying to mimic her movements, though he knew he was nowhere near as skilled. "You see them?" she whispered, her voice tense. Kyle strained his eyes, trying to peer into the darkness. And there, just beyond the streetlight, he saw them, the enemy soldiers. They were large, hulking creatures, their armor dark and intimidating. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. They were too many. "They're too close," Kyle muttered, panic creeping into his voice. Arya didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device. She activated it, and a holographic map of the area appeared in the air before them. Arya's fingers moved swiftly across the map, marking their position and the locations of the enemy. "They're blocking all exits," she said, her voice low but steady. "We'll have to fight our way through." Kyle nodded, but he didn't feel the same confidence she did. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained for this. He was just a man caught in a war that wasn't his. But as Arya turned to him, her eyes locking onto his with a silent intensity, he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her down. The enemy was closing in, but Kyle didn't move. He waited, watching Arya as she prepared herself. In that moment, everything else fell away. The fear, the doubts, the uncertainty. It was just him and her against the world. and he would follow her into whatever came next. Arya looked at him. Her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't place. For a brief second, it was just the two of them, standing on the edge of something bigger than both of them. Then, without a word, she gave him a slight nod, and they both moved forward into the fray. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The enemy soldiers, massive and intimidating, stood just a few feet away. Kyle's heart raced as he crouched in the shadows beside Arya, his breath shallow and fast. Arya's presence beside him was calming, but only to a point. She was calm, steady, and ready to fight. Kyle, on the other hand, felt his limbs tremble with fear. He had been in dangerous situations before, but nothing like this. The sheer size and power of the enemy were overwhelming. He could hear their heavy boots stomping the pavement, their weapons clanging against their armor as they moved into position. Every step they took seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. It was as if the city itself was on the verge of collapse. Arya was still, her body tense but poised. She had already assessed the situation, and Kyle could see that she was planning their next move. Her sharp eyes scanned the enemy soldiers, analyzing their movements. She knew exactly what she was doing, but for Kyle, it felt like they were walking into the mouth of a predator. "We have to move now," Arya whispered, her voice barely audible over the noise. "They'll be on us any second." Kyle nodded, his mind racing. He was terrified, but there was no turning back now. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was a part of this, whether he liked it or not. And for Arya, he had to be more than just a translator. He had to be someone she could rely on. Without another word, Arya sprang into action. She darted forward, quick as a shadow, her movements fluid and precise. Kyle followed, his feet moving on their own as he fought to keep up with her. The two of them moved as one, an unstoppable force. Arya took out two enemy soldiers with swift, deadly strikes, her alien weapons cutting through their armor like paper. Kyle barely had time to process what was happening before she was already on to the next target. As the battle raged around them, Kyle realized just how much he was depending on Arya. She was more than just a soldier. She was a force of nature, a warrior unlike anything he had ever seen. She moved with an almost unnatural grace, her every action calculated, precise, and deadly. Kyle, on the other hand, was fumbling, just trying to keep up with her. His hands shook as he lifted his weapon, unsure of what he was supposed to do. But Arya didn't give him time to second-guess himself. She was always a step ahead, guiding him with a simple gesture or a quick look. Whenever they were in danger, she pulled him to safety without a word. Whenever he hesitated, she gave him the push he needed. It was as if she knew exactly what he was capable of, and she wasn't going to let him back down. In the heat of battle, it was hard to think clearly. The sounds of gunfire, explosions, and alien screams filled the air. Every movement felt like life or death, but there was something in the way Arya fought that kept Kyle focused. She was unstoppable, and for a fleeting moment, Kyle wanted to be just like her. He wanted to be as strong as she was, as fearless, as fierce. But as they reached the center of the battlefield, Arya's expression changed. For the first time, Kyle saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was brief, gone in an instant, but it was there. She wasn't invincible. She was just like him. "What's wrong?" Kyle asked, his voice hoarse. Arya didn't answer immediately. She was focused on the Waku enemy, scanning for threats. But after a long pause, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "It's not just the enemy we're fighting," she said. "It's everything else, the pressure, the weight of it all." Kyle didn't know what to say. He had never thought about it that way before. For Arya, this war wasn't just about survival. It was about everything she had lost, everything she was fighting to protect. And in that moment, Kyle realized that he wasn't just helping her survive the battle. He was helping her survive herself. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Arya wasn't just a soldier fighting for her people. She was a person, struggling to hold on to the very thing that made her who she was. The war, the enemies, the constant fighting, it was all taking a toll on her. And Kyle had been so focused on his own fear that he hadn't seen it before. They moved again, pushing forward into the heart of the battle. Kyle had never felt more alive, but it wasn't just the adrenaline. It was the bond that was growing between him and Arya, the unspoken connection that was becoming more and more evident with each passing moment. As they fought side by side, Kyle knew that their journey together was just beginning. The war was far from over, and the dangers ahead were unimaginable. But for the first time, he felt ready. Ready to fight, ready to protect, and ready to be the man Arya needed him to be. The battlefield had grown eerily quiet. The sounds of war, once deafening, had suddenly faded. Kyle and Arya stood amidst the destruction, both of them catching their breath. The air was thick with smoke, and the scent of burning metal lingered. The streets were littered with debris, shattered glass, and fallen soldiers. It was a scene of chaos, yet there was a stillness between them that felt almost unnatural. Arya was the first to break the silence. She stood tall, her posture unwavering as she surveyed the surroundings. Her glowing eyes, once fierce and full of determination, were now distant, almost lost in thought. Kyle watched her closely, wondering what was going through her mind. He had seen her fight, seen her lead with unshakable confidence, but now, she seemed different. She seemed human. "It's quiet," Kyle said softly, his voice cutting through the silence. "Too quiet." Arya nodded, her expression hardening. "Don't be fooled," she replied, her voice low but firm. "The worst is yet to come." Kyle felt a shiver run down his spine. He had been hoping for a break, a moment of respite from the constant danger. But Arya's words reminded him that the fight wasn't over. It couldn't be over yet. Not with everything at stake. They continued forward, moving cautiously through the deserted streets. The once bustling city had become a ghost town, its people either evacuated or taken prisoner. Kyle felt a heavy weight settle on his chest. The alien world, so full of life just days ago, was now a shell of its former self. He wondered how long it would take for the planet to recover, if it ever would. As they moved deeper into the city, Kyle began to notice the subtle signs of the damage. Buildings were cracked, their foundations shaking under the strain of the ongoing war. Streets were torn up, as if the city itself was being torn apart from within. And yet, despite the destruction, there was something oddly peaceful about it. The quiet, the stillness, it was as though the city had become a place where time had stopped. "Where are we headed?" Kyle asked, breaking the silence once again. "To the command center," Arya answered. "We need to regroup and plan our next move." Kyle nodded. He wasn't sure what to expect at the command center, but he knew one thing: they couldn't keep fighting without a plan. They needed to think, to strategize. He had learned that from Arya. In the heat of battle, it was easy to lose sight of the bigger picture. But Arya always kept her eyes on the goal. She knew what needed to be done, and she would do whatever it took to achieve it. As they neared the command center, Kyle noticed the tension in Arya's posture. She was alert, her every sense focused on the task ahead. It was as if she could feel the storm building, even though it hadn't arrived yet. Kyle, however, was more focused on the feeling of uncertainty that was gnawing at him. This war was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The stakes were higher, the consequences more dire. And yet, there was something else, something beneath the surface that Kyle couldn't quite place. Arya stopped in her tracks, her hand raised in a signal for him to stay quiet. Kyle obeyed, his heart racing. They were close now, so close to the command center. He could see the faint glow of its lights in the distance, and the sound of footsteps grew louder. The enemy was near. "Stay here," Arya whispered, her eyes locking with his. I'll handle this." Kyle opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, she was gone. She disappeared into the shadows, moving with the same quiet grace that had defined her throughout the battle. Kyle stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come to rely on Arya, and now she was leaving him behind, but he understood. She was a warrior, and warriors didn't wait for permission. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours. Kyle couldn't help but wonder what was happening out there. Was Arya facing the enemy alone? Or was she gathering intel, preparing for the next phase of the battle? He trusted her, but he also knew the risks. This war was unpredictable, and every decision could mean life or death. Finally, Arya reappeared, her silhouette emerging from the darkness. She moved quickly, her steps light but purposeful. As she reached Kyle, she gave him a brief nod. "It's clear," she said. "We move in now." Kyle's heart surged with relief. He had been worried, but he knew better than to doubt Arya's instincts. She had been through worse. She had survived battles far more dangerous than this one, and she had always come out on top. Together, they approached the command center, their movements synchronized. As they entered the building, the air was thick with anticipation. This was it. The next step in their fight for survival. Kyle could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had Arya by his side, and that was all that mattered. The command center was nothing like Kyle had imagined. It was a place of quiet intensity, filled with soldiers and commanders, all working tirelessly to coordinate the defense of the planet. The walls were lined with holographic displays and maps, each one tracking the movements of the enemy forces. The air was thick with the hum of technology, and yet, despite the advanced equipment, the atmosphere felt tense and strained. There was no comfort here, only the cold, hard reality of war. Kyle and Arya entered the room, their presence immediately noticed by the commanders. They stood in the back, silent for a moment as they surveyed the scene. Kyle couldn't help but feel out of place. He was just a human, no soldier, no warrior. He had no business being here. But Arya was with him, and that made him feel like he had a purpose, like he mattered in this moment. "Arya," one of the commanders said, nodding in acknowledgement. "We've been waiting for you." Arya gave a brief nod in return, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the room for any sign of weakness. She was always alert, always aware. Kyle noticed the way her gaze moved over the commanders, assessing them, judging them. He couldn't help but admire how confident she was. She had seen this before. She had been through the worst, and she was still standing. But Kyle also saw the way her jaw tightened, the subtle signs of exhaustion in her posture. The weight of everything was starting to catch up with her. "We need to prepare for the final assault," Arya said, her voice steady but firm. "The enemy is going to launch everything they have at us in the next few hours. We need a plan." One of the commanders, a tall, imposing alien with green skin, stepped forward. "We're already preparing the defenses, but we need more than just strength. We need strategy. Can you help us with that?" Arya glanced at Kyle, her eyes flicking to him briefly before she spoke again. "Yes," she said. "But we can't do this alone. We need everyone to work together, no more divisions. It's the only way we have a chance." Kyle watched as the commanders nodded in agreement. They understood the gravity of the situation, and for the first time, Kyle realized just how important Arya was to this fight. She wasn't just a soldier, she was a leader. And in this war, she was their only hope. As the plan unfolded, Kyle began to understand the full scope of the battle. It wasn't just about defeating the enemy. It was about preserving everything that mattered, the lives of their people, the future of their planet. The stakes had never been higher, and Kyle had never felt more out of his depth. But as he looked at Arya, he realized that he had a role to play in this war. No matter how small, he had to help. He had to do his part. The next few hours were a blur. The room was filled with activity as the commanders organized their forces, preparing for the final push. Kyle found himself swept up in the preparations, his mind racing with questions and uncertainties. He wasn't a fighter, but there was one thing he could do. He could help coordinate the communications, translate the alien strategies, and ensure that everyone understood the plan. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the plan was finalized, the commanders gave their orders, and the room fell silent for a moment. Arya turned to Kyle, her eyes meeting his with a look that said everything. They had come this far together, and now it was time for the final step. The battle was waiting. The enemy was waiting, and they were ready. "Are you with me?" Arya asked, her voice soft but steady. Kyle didn't hesitate. "Always," he said, his voice unwavering. Arya gave him a brief smile before turning back to the commanders. The final assault had begun. The next few minutes were a blur of movement. Kyle found himself in the thick of it, the chaos of battle surrounding him. Arya was a blur of motion ahead of him, her glowing form cutting through the enemy forces with deadly precision. Kyle stayed close, doing his best to keep up, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never imagined that his life would come to this. He had never imagined that he would be fighting alongside aliens to save a planet he had only just come to understand. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was survival. And as he followed Arya through the fray, he knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. The battle raged on, but Kyle felt a strange sense of calm. With Arya by his side, anything seemed possible. They were a team, and that was all that mattered. The chaos of battle raged around them, but amidst the noise and confusion, Kyle and Arya fought on. The once bustling city was now a war zone. Its streets littered with debris, its buildings shattered and crumbling. The enemy was relentless, their forces pressing forward with everything they had. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming odds, Kyle could feel the determination in his chest. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore, he was fighting for something greater. He was fighting for Arya, for the people of this world, for their future. Arya was a whirlwind of motion, her alien weapons cutting through the enemy ranks with deadly precision. She moved like a shadow, striking when least expected and disappearing before the enemy could retaliate. Kyle had never seen anything like it. She was more than just a soldier, she was a force of nature. But even she couldn't keep up the pace forever. Kyle could see the strain in her movements, the exhaustion in her eyes. The battle had taken its toll, and the end was nowhere in sight. As they moved through the battlefield, Kyle found himself thinking back to the moment when it all began. When he first met Arya, when he had no idea what he was getting into. He had been so out of place, so unsure of himself. But now, standing beside her, fighting by her side, he knew he had changed. He wasn't the same man who had arrived on this alien world. He had learned what it meant to fight for something bigger than himself. Keep going. Arya shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. We're almost there. Kyle nodded, pushing himself forward. They had to reach the command center. They had to stop the enemy from launching their final attack. It was their last chance to turn the tide of the war. The pressure was immense, but Kyle felt something inside him stir. He wasn't going to back down, not now. Not when they had come this far. Together, they pressed forward, their movements synchronized. Arya led the charge, clearing the way as Kyle followed closely behind. They fought their way through the enemy forces, dodging incoming fire and taking down enemy soldiers with swift, precise strikes. Kyle wasn't as skilled as Arya, but he had learned. He had learned how to fight, how to survive. He had learned how to be strong when it mattered. As they neared the command center, the sounds of battle grew louder. The enemy was closing in. But they weren't going to stop. Kyle and Arya had come too far to turn back now. The command center was within sight, but the enemy was already preparing to launch their final assault. It was now or never. "We're almost there," Arya said, her voice calm despite the madness surrounding them. "Stay close." Kyle didn't need to be told twice. He stayed close, his eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. The enemy was everywhere, their soldiers filling the streets, their weapons trained on them. But Arya was moving with purpose, her every action calculated and precise. She was a leader, a warrior, and in that moment, Kyle knew that he would follow her to the ends of the earth, if that's what it took. They reached the command center's entrance, but the door was locked. Arya wasted no time, pulling out a small device from her pocket. She inserted it into the door's control panel, and within seconds, the door slid open. They entered the command center, and Kyle felt a wave of relief wash over him. They were inside. They had made it. The room was filled with alien soldiers and commanders, all of them focused on the task at hand. They turned to look at Arya as she entered, their eyes filled with respect and admiration. She was their leader, the one who had guided them through the worst of the war. And now they were ready for the final push. "Prepare the final assault," Arya ordered, her voice steady and commanding. "We're ending this today." Kyle stood beside her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea how they would win this fight, but he knew one thing for sure. With Arya by his side, they had a chance. She was more than just a soldier. She was the hope that this planet needed. She was the reason they had fought so hard, and she was the reason they would fight until the very end. As the final assault was launched, Kyle felt a surge of adrenaline rush through him. The battle wasn't over yet, but the end was in sight. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for Arya, for the future of this world, for everything they had fought for together. And as the enemy forces began to retreat, Kyle knew one thing for certain. They had won. The battle was over, but their journey was just beginning.